Dr. Richard Campagna is one of Iowa City's true Renaissance men, an existentialist philosopher, lawyer, instructor, and he was the Libertarian Party's candidate for Vice President of the United States in the 2004 election. Welcome, Dr. Campagna. And maybe you could start by defining our terms. Could you tell our audience, please, what is existentialism? What is an existentialist, or more specifically, an optimistic existentialist, such as you call yourself? And then we can get into a little of what that means in practice.
Sure. It's my favorite topic, so I never grow tired of defining it, redefining it, and explaining in practical terms how it works. My definition of existentialism is very broad, and it simply means the conducting of one's life, one's existence, with no prepackaged formula or game plan in terms of how you expect life to turn out. And while it doesn't mean that you cannot plan or prepare for a career or a family life or a personal, professional, and philosophic way of looking at things, I think that the most important component of an existential philosophy is to shuffle the cards, shuffle the deck almost on a daily basis, and look at the cards that you're dealt on a daily basis, look at your own mind as a malleable and ongoing object in development, and basically live each day on your own terms and with your own free will within your own mental and physical constraints.
Okay, well now let me see if I've got this straight. Are you basically saying that under the broad tent of existentialism, you pretty much are what you say you are, or do you have to sometimes say, no, I'm not that yet, but I'm working toward it?
I would argue that you almost never can define yourself. You're almost always in constant flux, and you would try not to say who you are or what you are, but just by your actions and your emotions and your thoughts, you constantly make yourself. You are a work in progress, and only when you, I guess, cease to exist on this earth would your essence or yourself be defined.
All right, and you have mentioned before that probably the powers that be, the government, the moneyed interests, academia, and so on, you mentioned that you believe that those people fear an existentialist more than anything else. Is that really the case? And if so, why?
I don't think anyone would ever admit to fearing an existentialist, although many people would say they don't even know what it is, so they don't fear it, or they don't even know what it is. They just think it's kind of crazy talk. But if I prod it and pursue it a little more, it does seem to me that a nice, ordinary, hardworking, gentle person like myself, who perhaps overuses the term a little bit just to make my point, but it seems to me that since people don't know exactly what is meant by the term and don't really like not knowing exactly what person they're going to see or meet in any given day, it's somewhat fearful to people. They think that it's just, they're unable to get a handle on it, as opposed to some of the other titles or disciplines, be they socialism, liberalism, constitutionalism, Aristotelianism. And for some reason, I just note that people seem uncomfortable with the term existentialism, even when I tack on the optimistic existentialist tag, which is what I consider myself to be.
Okay, and how does your behavior as an optimistic existentialist contrast with a pessimistic existentialist?
Okay, and that is really the key question. So I'm glad you asked it. The traditional existentialism was all considered to be pessimistic existentialism. The European existentialists in the late 1800s through the 1900s, and probably up until the 60s, 1960s, was considered pessimistic because if life doesn't have a prepackaged program or an easy answer or a game plan to follow, and therefore could be said by some to be rendered meaningless, then that is considered to be a bad thing because people don't have goals, so they think. They don't have goals and they don't have a path, so therefore they find life to be scary and untreaded waters, and therefore most people think that traditional existentialism is a bad thing, or hence pessimistic about the human condition. I say all of those things are true, but that's a great thing. Once you realize that and you know that the path is really unique and your own and constantly changing, once you can come to that realization and get practice doing it, it's actually a joyful, optimistic, and wonderful, liberating force. And that's why I call myself, being on that path, that's why I call myself the optimistic existentialist.
Okay, I keep coming back to a phrase that Albert Camus was fond of. He said, la lutte elle-même vers le sommet suffit à remplir un cœur d'homme. Il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. That is, you have to imagine that Sisyphus is happy. The struggle to the summit in itself is enough to fill a man's heart. You must imagine that Sisyphus is happy. And that can be taken, I suppose, as either or both, pessimistic or optimistic. Do you think so?
Yes. I mean, and that is, you could argue that that is sort of the beginning of optimistic existentialism. In other words, yes, it is a struggle. Life is a struggle, and struggle sort of has a bad connotation. So therefore, if you're struggling, then that's bad, then that's pessimistic. But I would argue almost like, I remember getting my teeth cleaned as a child. I really didn't mind it. I actually kind of liked it. There was just a little bit of pain, but it wasn't that bad. And then when it went away, the teeth were clean, and the pain was barely there. It was just little pricking pain.
Plus, nobody was drilling.
Nobody was drilling, and therefore I said, I actually like this process. I kind of know or think that I know how it's going to come out, and it's just fun to be on the road.
Okay. That makes a certain amount of sense. Now, you have mentioned also that academia is not welcoming to existentialism, indeed not welcoming to questioning or debating the way it used to be at one point. Is that the case, and why is that?
Okay, and again, we were briefly discussing this before we went on the air. Here is my thinking. I learned everything I know about existentialism, and I would say the judicial or legal counterpart of existentialism in a legal setting, which is termed judicial realism. So I learned about these theories when I was a very young man, and they really helped to get my philosophy of life, which is optimistic existentialism with a spiritual twist, in order. Very early on, and so I was so grateful to the academics and to my universities that taught me this. I was one of the few people of my generation, even though you would have thought there would have been many more, and that would be sort of a college student in the late 60s and early 70s. But apparently I was unique, or somewhat unique. Anyhow, fast forward 40 years, and I'm still in my teaching duties and writing and lecturing and all of my activities. I'm always bringing in existentialism, judicial realism, and various sort of offshoots of those ideas and those approaches to life, I have found that some of the very same fine universities that taught these tenets and approaches to me are not that open to having me or others in the field lecture and talk about it much anymore. They seem to be shying away from it.
Now, why is that? Why don't they like it anymore?
Okay. I don't know for sure, but I think it's because existentialism, which is one small component of one department, philosophy, and you could argue psychology as well, is a little contrary to academic discipline. It's sort of the opposite of social sciences. It doesn't really, depending upon the historian's approach, it's not all that consistent, I think, with the modern teaching of history, but certainly from the social scientific or traditional philosophical bounds, or maybe even literary criticism, people, it seems to make them uneasy because existentialism, as we said before, doesn't go along with traditional pre-programmed modes of analysis.
Okay. Now, it seems to me that academia has largely been taken over by ultra-leftist, ultra-progressive, we sometimes call them social justice warriors, who sort of revel in the culture of victimhood and classism and identity politics and so on. Why is that not reconcilable with existentialism? Or can it be reconciled with existentialism?
Yeah, and the answer is it can be. Well, I'm not sure about the victimhood aspect of it and the political correctness aspect of, you know, left-leaning liberal philosophy, but if nothing else, just the general concept of existentialism and free will and making of your life what you, in an ongoing way, seem to do, that came out of the left. That was formed in the left-leaning traditions of, you know, the Ivy League when I attended there, and other schools. So if anything, the argument should be that the left should be much more in tune with an existential approach than the political right. And so I guess I don't have an explanation as to why, other than they've lost their way somewhere along the way. But it's baffling to me.
Yeah. It strikes me when you talk about how existentialists are dangerous, that if you wanted to boil it down, you might say that the leftist is very much concerned with his concept of fairness, whereas the rightist is very much concerned with his concept of order. And there is the great dichotomy, order versus fairness. And sometimes they are hard to reconcile. Now, existentialism would appear to militate against both of those. We tend to say, well, if we're existentialists, we say, well, life is unfair, life is unjust, and perfect order is counterproductive because you do have to reshuffle the deck every day.
That's right. So maybe that's the best explanation as to why I find that I'm not being embraced by universities or institutions on the left or the right or even in the center, which is each of the institutions has a point of view which either seeks order or traditional order or new order through fairness and political correctness. But I think you're right. Both have been at odds, or both concepts are at odds with at least my version of existential behavior and approach.
And here's another idea I'd like to throw out. Existentialists tend to be very realistic. We see life as it is, and sometimes we also see life as we would wish it to be, but we have to admit that it's only a wish and that We might strive toward it, but it is not the current reality. Whereas the typical social justice warrior, the typical politically correct type, will say it's the narrative, not the truth, that counts, and we must pretend that things are a certain way. That's what political correctness is about, in my opinion. It's a war on noticing. You're not supposed to notice that such and such person is crazy, or that such and such person is engaging in antisocial behavior, or that such and such philosophy is a crock of bull. You're just not supposed to notice that. Whereas an existentialist will notice it and will point it out. Am I right?
I think that's right. I think intellectual honesty and genuineness, both with regard to others, society at large, and even the most painful part, yourself. You must be genuine and intellectually honest about yourself and who you are. And that, to me, is really the key, the core of what it means to live an optimistic, existential way.
And speaking of intellectual honesty, there seems to be less of it going on these days, in my opinion. I don't know, maybe I just am painting the past with a more flattering color than it deserves, but I have noticed, particularly in the social media, that a lot of people just will not be intellectually honest in debate. They will move the goalposts, they will set up false equivalencies and false dichotomies, they will use just about every logical fallacy you can think of, and then they'll rationalize it when you point it out to them. It seems to me that this is getting worse and worse, and that people don't see the basic immorality of such dishonesty.
I have to concur with that observation, and I'm glad you mentioned this term, the immorality of intellectual dishonesty, because people oftentimes say, well, what is the morality? What are the tenets of morality of existentialism?
So let's hear about those.
And so in response to the question that you sort of instigated and that I am now carrying on, my version of optimistic existentialism is a little fudged, and that's why I add the spiritual optimistic existentialist in me. So it starts on top, and just arbitrarily I said, I'm kind of going to start with the 10 Commandments on top, something that I was taught as a child in that famous Charlton Heston movie, The 10 Commandments. So I said, you know, those for the most part are pretty reasonable. So I'm going to put them on top. So I'm not a full-blown, freewheeling existentialist who just does whatever he or she wants. I do put the 10 Commandments up there. However, I must also say that some of them seem to be a little more important than others. So there might be a few where I might fudge a little bit. But for the most part, 10 Commandments, in my version of existentialism, that's the top end of morality. But that big, and I'll tell you what is at the bottom, but the big chunk in the middle is free will, be intellectually honest and genuine, be true to yourself and to others, and be yourself. And that's the guts of the morality, the only guts of the morality that existentialists live for 90% of their lives. And on the bottom is, stay out of Johnson County Jail. Whatever you do, don't let your existential acts and image get you caught in jail or anything contrary to the law, even if you think that the law is stupid or whatever. Stay out of the county jail. That's the least we can do.
Very good. And to go back to the 10 Commandments, would you say that it's easy or difficult to reconcile existentialism with the Judeo-Christian tradition and with, indeed, belief in God or membership in the church?
membership in the church is something that I have struggled with. And as a loving husband, I do attend the church of my wife. And as best I can, I communicate with my idea of what a God would be. But it's mostly just to talk about the Ten Commandments and to just, be there. I think that membership in a church and really following the nitty-gritty details, which perhaps go too deeply into one's free will and this big chunk of life that I talk about, is a bit difficult.
So it would be hard to be an observant, practicing, communing Catholic and be an existentialist, for example.
For example, I think that's right. There are the literature and the history of the world, though, has many such figures who tried to do that or tried to mix it up better than I did. Kierkegaard, Unamuno, I want to say Viktor Frankl, I believe, was trying to be an observant Jew. I could be mistaken. But there are many, and their writings and their lives really do show the struggle that they had when trying to be strictly observant of an organized religion and an existential freethinker.
Okay, and now shifting from religion to politics, we are going to see a change in government in January of 2017, and it's not one that I'm feeling optimistic about, and I don't imagine you are either, but from an existentialist point of view, how does one cope with the ever-increasing encroachment of the government on personal liberty, on one's control of one's own destiny, and so forth?
And again, I share with you the utter horror of what might come from this election and the next administrations or two or three in this country, because at least on the surface, all of the political parties, certainly the major ones, really do seem that they want to help people, and I use the term lightly, to order their lives, to get everything in order, focusing heavily on economic and maybe social behavior and political and economic behavior. And basically that, by definition, big government is antithetical to the existentialist. What I have done all my life is conduct my life, try my best, again, to follow the Ten Commandments and to keep out of the Johnson County Jail, which I have done quite successfully. But in the middle, just really conduct my life, the inner life, with my own thoughts and my own heart and my own actions in a very private and personal way, so that government or any institutional encroacher does not get involved.
Okay, and we are in a university town. A lot of our viewers are students and faculty, I dare say. And if they are going down this same path of existentialism, or specifically optimistic existentialism, how do they stay afloat in an academic situation that is obviously very hostile to the existentialist outlook? How do you get through it without facing personal destruction or without losing your job or whatever you're concerned about?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I am thrilled and honored to say this is really the pinnacle of this program, and also, I would argue, of my life. The University of Iowa has been an incredible exception to the encroachment and the closed-mindedness that I described earlier in the program. Especially recently, I have seen from various aspects of the university and Kirkwood as well, and even the state of Iowa, an openness to many of the ideas and more that we just talked about today. So the good news is I've noted that Iowans, far more so, when they finally talk about some of the themes we've talked about, especially young Iowans, are far more open to these ideas than I would have ever imagined. I would argue far more open to them than the New York young people and millennials from where I come. And so has the university. And I can't say enough kind things about University of Iowa. I've been here for 25 years. It's been a long trek, but that is what I'm noticing, and I'll have more to say about that in the future.
And if you're a student or a teacher, how do you stay true to yourself and speak your mind if you want to, while insulating yourself from this rather vicious, vindictive political correctness that we see on a lot of college campuses today, where you are doxxed, or your job is put in danger, or your academic standing is put in danger if you have the wrong ideas? Do you just have to shut up, or is there a method for saying what you want to say without causing the world to come crashing down on you?
And I think my best answer to that question is, from a political or public policy, public issue point of view, you're better advised to shut up. Even though it might be painful, and you might say, how can I be genuine to myself if I can't even talk about, my deepest political beliefs or my aversion to excessive political correctness or whatever? But I have found probably better to shut up on those matters and just be open and honest and be yourself on every other aspect of your life: the personal, the professional, the philosophical, the spiritual, and handle your politics and some of the more public issues in a more reticent way.
Some would argue that if you do that, you're just allowing the situation to get worse and more rotten and so on. For example, if you don't dissent politically, then you're going to have more and more oppression, more and more of the politics of personal destruction. Is there just nothing you can do about it?
Yes, that probably is, it's a good argument, and it's probably the more truthful argument. Probably I'm looking at it from a 64-year-old man's perspective, and it seems, looking at it from my personal and familial and close circle of friends and contacts, probably better for us to follow that guideline. I think that maybe for younger people who are of this bent, that can be something that could be their life's purpose, to try and figure out how to be open and honest, not only personally, professionally, familially, but to see how you can somehow come back and expand your intellectual honesty to include more public policy issues.
Okay, and do you believe that there is a future to existentialism, or do you think that it's going to be that the forces of society are just going to kill it off, and you only have about 30 seconds?
The answer is, I see it. I've seen little surges of revival, particularly in Iowa and with the good folks of the Midwest, interestingly enough. In the long run, I don't know, but I can only hope, and I want to go out with the full force of existential optimism in my own life and with that of people around me.
And on that note, we have to end this show, but thank you very much, Dr. Richard Campagna, for explaining existentialism to us, and thank you all.
Thank you.